So welcome everybody. I'm Derek Weston. I'm the chair of the Friends of KITP. So I want to welcome all the friends and all the friends of friends and friends of friends of friends. We are delighted to have you here. One of the terrific advantages of the KITP is that it combines disciplines, a great variety of disciplines. So there's an opportunity for theoreticians in physics and biology and mathematics and computational science to confer together and allow science to move forward. And we extend that beyond just science to art and science. So periodically with the friends we have an event like tonight in which we highlight the fascinating connections between science and art. I encourage all of you to join the friends. If you look on a little podium or on the table outside, you'll see a little flyer. Joining the friends is a great deal and it really helps KITP. So I hope you'll consider it if you have not already done so. So one of the most exciting things to happen with the KITP in the last year is that Lars Bilston has become our executive director. We are exceedingly fortunate to have somebody so talented, and we are looking forward to the years ahead. Lars?
Well, I just want to give a very brief welcome. And first off, I always like to ask a question of the audience to see if you're with me. So for how many of you is this your first time here? Okay, it's good. It's good. We have conferences, sometimes it's more than half, and I feel even better in that instance. So what do we do here at the Institute? We don't have art openings that frequently. What we are is a facility for the community, international community of theoretical physicists. So here we run programs, 20 to 25 people at a time, that come here for 2 to 4 months from all around the world to work on problems that we have deemed important in working with our advisory board. We typically have 3 programs happening at any one time, so often there's 70 to 75 visitors in this building. This week and next week are rare in that we have no visitors here. There was some conjunction of calendars that led us to having 2 weeks of no programs. The staff are very happy about that. As director, I worry about what opportunities we're missing, but I think it's great for us to have a little bit of downtime. Those programs end up adding up to about 800 unique visitors coming through the Institute every year, coming to Santa Barbara every year, and interacting and doing science here, and that's what goes on. So if you drive by the building and wonder what's happening, the world's best physicists are here thinking deep thoughts, hopefully inspired by the environment, the building, and the art in the building. So that's what we do, and that is pretty much what goes on here. The only a brief announcement I want to make is we have public lecture on December 5th. So many of you, that's a open public lecture, so please RSVP if you haven't. You can simply go to the website at the Institute's homepage and see what the RSVP email is. That's a lecture by Leo Kovenhoven from Delft, who will be here to tell us about a breakthrough in experimental condensed matter physics that is one step of many steps that need to be made to build a quantum computer, which you might be hearing about. Maybe your great-grandchildren will get to have a quantum computer, but we'll see. So to tonight's event, I really just want to introduce Peter Frank, who's an art critic who has been gracious enough to come and do this again for us. I just want to thank him for coming and hand the mic to him, and of course remind him that his job is keeping the artists in the box. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Lars. Actually, thank you very much. My job is actually to keep all of you and myself in the box because I'm hoping that once we get a good understanding from each of the artists about what motivates him or her, that we can open up the discussion to the audience. I think the artists agree with me that a discussion among all of us is that much more fruitful than just among ourselves. I want to introduce each of the artists, and I guess we're going to 4. All right, I'll stand.
There's a chair.
Okay, I'll sit. The artists present are Tatiana Ginsberg, Jean-Pierre Hébert, Jeremy Sarchet, and Ethan Turpin. Vera Molnar couldn't be with us this evening. She's 83 years old and lives in Paris, and that's one of those factors or the other is creates enough difficulties. Both creates close to impossibility. But she's been working in this field since at least the 1960s, and it's especially impressive to have her work hanging here among the others. She's been a kind of whether they know it or not, she's been an inspiration to them. So why don't we have the artists come and sit facing the audience and me. This I trust is the most awkward part of the evening. Let's see. By the way, am I the keyboard player tonight?
I just thought I would do. I mean, I thought I would do it myself.
Oh, yeah, please, yeah, excellent. So each of you would go to the console and run through your images. Terrific. Let's do it that way. We're going to proceed alphabetically. In fact, is it by accident that you have arrayed yourselves alphabetically? Right. Okay. Of course, to you it's reverse order. But and F come before G, so I'll sit here. Then, what I want to ask each of the artists before we open it up to you are questions about their methods and techniques. I'll let them expand on their content, and I'll let your questions expand further. But it seems to me that what jumps out, particularly in this group of work, is not so much what is being done, but how. In all such work, of course, there's no real division between what and how. But at various extremes, you can identify how from what. Both are of equal interest, but I'm going to start with the how, and we'll work towards the what in each case. Tatiana, you work on the East Coast now, but you were working here, and we're working, your emphasis is on cast paper and paper making.
Yes. I guess I should just hold this one. I have this other mic that makes me feel like a terrorist or something. I lived here for 4 years, and I know Jean-Pierre from our collaborations during the time that I lived here, and was a graduate student in the art department here at UCSB. And then I stayed and I taught for 2 more years. And so we got to know each other through kind of my process of paper making and through our kind of curiosity about different processes that we might use for various means. Sorry. I got off a long plane flight, so I'm not as with it as I usually am, but I'll try to speak fast like a good East Coast girl. So, and speak into the mic a little more. My methods are usually involving paper. I make all my own paper because doing that process is kind of the elemental connection that I have with what's going on in the world. My curiosity about natural processes, my curiosity about physics. Not being a scientist, I have sort of a empirical, intuitive way of working, and so I use paper as a kind of thinking process in the way that maybe some of the string theory guys in the other room are drawing on the blackboard. I'm making paper.
So, in effect, you're the closest thing we have in this particular show to a sculptor.
Yeah, I guess so.
Yeah. We had a sculptor in the last show, and that opened up not issues, but demonstrations of possibilities there. And I think by implication, you're working with a substance. You're shaping a substance is an affirmation of the physicality both of acting and thinking. So, and I think that's I got a feeling from your from the works, particularly the works that you with which you collaborated, Jean-Pierre, that that was a chance for Jean-Pierre to give substance to his images, and for you to give given the implied kinesis in his images, to give almost a time, an implication of time in your material.
Mm.
So, would you like to run us through?
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay, so if can you all hear me? Okay. I will try to project.
Good. If you want to.
Should I use this one instead? One or the other. Okay. The IT says no. In my work, I thought I would just talk for a minute about my inspirations before kind of talking about my work itself. And my work comes from kind of curiosity about the world, going from looking at things very closely to looking at them far away and thinking about how, what's happening, what am I seeing in the world. So this first image is the same as the second image, but the focus is different. So I'm doing this all the time in my own work, thinking about moving from something very tight to something kind of large, looking at things that are natural patterns on a small scale that mimic or suggest things on a larger scale, maybe a cosmic scale. So I thought I would just show you a few inspirations. I'm a paper maker. This is what paper fiber, all of the fiber that I used for the pieces that are upstairs looks like before it's paper. And it looks like what it is, which is bark, tree bark. And that process of transforming paper into its ultimate expression, for me, is my constant inspiration. It's kind of like spinning straw into gold. You have this moment when something really magical happens. I also studied natural dyes in Japan and lived in Japan for a couple of years. And I find a lot of inspiration from materials. So this is indigo, which also looks a whole lot like maybe things that we find, like this picture of Iceland during the volcanic eruption from space. I'm also looking a lot at maps and sort of patterns that happen. I love this idea that you could kind of lay out every river and measure their length. And so I work a lot from maps and from existing kind of tracks of how we get places and from tracks of how other things get places. This is snail trails. So I'll talk about that a little bit more, but these are tiny snails that are eating their way across algae on the windows of a greenhouse at the college I teach at Mount Holyoke College. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. Stains. I think stains are sort of an underappreciated source of really interesting things that are happening when something dries. I think you all at KITP can appreciate this picture. We get lots of inspiration from coffee, right? But I've been recently working on a series of prints, which unfortunately are not done for this show, but that use this kind of coffee crema galaxy, if you will, like a little sort of spiral coming out of things that we see just, in our daily life, our daily rituals. And a lot of the inspiration that I have for the work that's upstairs comes from plants, and from especially plants that have been somebody's lunch, like these. I've been using and collecting insect-eaten leaves, and like that first slide that I showed, you really see this kind of pattern of light that travels through, and thinking about how light kind of comes through leaves, but especially leaves that have been damaged. I draw these using sort of illuminating them at home, and then it's essentially next to impossible to see what you're doing while you're doing this because it's dark on dark. So I basically draw and kind of transform in the process of drawing the shadows into different kinds of works. Here's something very representational, and then some of the works that are upstairs are more abstract. These, for me, I think are particularly interesting because a lot of them come from one or two leaves, but just how I create the shadows, how I create the paper itself changes it, so each one is completely different. Some of the works that are upstairs, like this one, are lithographs. So I make the paper is finished, and then I'm printing on top of it. Some of them I'm drawing directly on top of it. Some are etchings, color pencil. This work is upstairs. This is based on a map of the Åland Islands, where I did a residency. It's between Finland and Sweden, an area with thousands and thousands of islands. So it's also looks a whole lot like the lichens that they have there. And this piece that is upstairs is a traditional etching plus which is a copper plate. And in the process of making the copper plate, you take some excess copper off the sides. And what's left is these little spirals. So the spiral image comes from the copper itself. Last, I want to just talk about an installation work so that you kind of see how my work, 2D work, relates back to this sculptural idea maybe that Peter was talking about. I do a lot of installations and things that are not 2D, and I try to think of them as being related. I also make artist books. This is the greenhouse at Mount Holyoke College where I teach now. And we had a faculty show in which we had too many faculty for the space, and so they were looking for people to do projects outside, and I said, good, I will go away, and I will do this project in the greenhouse instead. So I did an installation which uses the forms of the plants, in particular that really huge rose that spans the two spaces and has been there since before anyone remembers who's ever worked at the greenhouse. And I took cross-section patterns of roses and ivy, because the roses and ivy are growing kind of on top of each other, and I blew them up, and I made these cut vinyl pieces on the window, which in a lot of ways is really the same thing that I'm doing with the drawings, where they're casting shadows, and yet it's happening in a space that you can walk through and you can move within. There's also some text on the walls from Lewis Carroll's The Hunting of the Snark. And the patterns during the day change constantly, and during different times of year they change constantly, and depending on what's blooming, it also changes. So in that way, I think it's fun to sort of work in space as well as on a 2D surface. On the back side of the greenhouse was another installation. This part had to come down. The other part is sort of semi-permanent. I used a door space that is not really used that much in the greenhouse daily life. So they let me basically turn it into a little vitrine in which to show a video of the makers of those little trails that are running through the greenhouse. And what I really loved about this is that we have a faculty member who has studied snails for 30 years. And he did not know that we had snails in the greenhouse until I did this project. So it also has some little text from The Hunting of the Snark. And there's the snails. The snails are about pinky size, so it took me a long time to find them, but I found them based on the patterns that they left on the windows. So I guess that's maybe a way of just saying, like, the more you pay attention, the more inspiration you can find from the same thing you pass every day. So We could watch this forever, but we can also kind of get mesmerized into snail world.
Thank you. This is a different species of snail than we're used to out here, right? Either that or the color registration is off by some.
There's many types of snails.
Oh, to be sure. But the garden snails out here are actually an introduced species. In fact, they're supposedly the species of snail that are delicacy in France and other parts of Europe. I don't know if they're the same species as that they eat in, say, Thailand, but they're edible if you can think that far. This does not look like
I don't think these are edible.
No.
Also too small.
Exactly. Yeah. I can't imagine eating anything that color. At any rate, I had a question about your method, but I think you may have answered it. So if it occurs to me during the course of it, and it turns out you hadn't answered it, I'll get back to you. But I wanted to go on to sometime collaborator Jean-Pierre Hébert, who's Jean-Pierre. Are you still officially in residence here?
Officially, I guess so. Yes.
Okay.
That's not very official, but
No, well,
I'm the ghost of the place.
If you have a key, you're official. At any rate, Jean-Pierre has been began as a physicist and evolved. You didn't?
No, never.
No.
No, only my children do, but not me.
Oh, okay. Doesn't that happen all the time? You get mixed up with your children. All right. But you've been working with the physics and physical properties since the 60s, and I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with work he's shown here and elsewhere in the Santa Barbara area for quite a few years. But I noticed in this grouping of work not simply a great, but an increasing diversity of form and of material that caught me by pleasant surprise. I'd worked fairly closely with Jean-Pierre a few years ago on a catalog he did, and at that time he was focusing on certain very few methods, but beginning to branch out with their possibilities. It seems to me that these branchings have continued and trebled to the point where you almost have to be running after the form to find the connections. And I hope that Jean-Pierre can expand on what he's doing in each of these several bodies of work that you see upstairs. So why don't I move you to the console?
Okay.
And you have a throat mic too? It's working for you?
Is that working?
Yeah.
Good.
Just when it's getting really good.
I want to do that. Wrong key. That's not me.
Great labor-saving device.
That's not me. That's me.
Good.
So I will go quickly in my presentation showing a lot of images. Yes, I push play. Okay. And I have too many slides, so I will go quickly and reach the point where I can start answering Peter's question. So here I start showing very old works that's about 35 or 40 years old. And some of them I have shown here in town. This image is important to me because it was a development of my work from, I would say, 2D to 3D or more. And that happened to me working on the pier at the harbor and watching the effect of the waves on the mast of yachts and discovering how much more interesting they were looked at in the water rather than in reality. So more ancient drawings there. Many of them are 20 years old. Some of these are more recent, like this one, was based on astrophysics or deviation of light by galaxies. And I've worked on geometry quite a bit. And then at some point, I was introduced to the idea of chance, read a lot of Fluxus literature, of John Cage literature, and tried to introduce that in my work. So far, my work had been essentially based on geometry, going from 2 to 3 or 4 dimensions projected on paper. And at some point, I wanted to be full master of all my images, and I tried to program them as accurately and precisely as possible. But then, at some point, about when I started the residency here, I became interested in having surprises that would be a little gift to me as I was working. So I started to work taming chance and trying to bring diversity in the different medium I was using. After ink on paper, I started to use sand, and then I started to use water, and more recently started also to use printmaking. I think using text also as well, which I have started to introduce in my work in 2009 for a show at IHC. And I have done it more and more often to introduce a different dimension in my work to avoid a little bit an excess of abstraction, or also to find a way to add another dimension of poetry. The piece I have here, for instance, is illustrated. It's called Orpheus, and it's illustrated by short sentences from Jean Cocteau, which are happening in the movie Orpheus. And they're in French, but they are very poetic and very surrealist, very interesting. And there was no way that I could do that only with lines. And so that the addition that text allows me to have. So here are a few pieces with text like that. And as well as I have introduced writing in drawings, I've also made drawings with fonts and letters and writings, using them to provide shapes on the paper in simple or more complex ways, translating entire text into drawings. I have plans to do that more. And after that, I've been interested also in the notions of palindrome and symmetries for images, as I am for text. And I have done a lot of work like that, which are kind of relaxing for me, because I borrow the works of others and I run them through a simple piece of Python code that I wrote, and it creates all kinds of magical things. And it's very fun for me to do that. So I have a few examples going on. And then we're getting closer to recent times, where I started to use actually time to create works. And I create time by using time as a parameter that gets involved in computing all the geometry of the drawing I want to create. And the basic idea was to avoid forcibly to be able to do the same piece twice, because it's never the same time on the watch and on the calendar. So the software works on a century basis. So within a century, I would never be able to reproduce the drawing that you see here, or that one. So I have shown this work at KITP, I think, 2 years ago. And I call it Wheel of Time. I have used that also to illustrate books and to create poetry. And I have a book that has been in publication for quite some time, which I will show you 2 pages of, which is a book created using the mesosticks form popularized by John Cage, if I may say so, to turn Invisible Cities by Italo Calvino into a book of poems that I illustrated. So I have one page here, another there. Then, always interested by time, I created simple pieces where I use time as a direct factor for creating an image, and you will understand that those different grids are actually the hands of a clock, and they create all kind of very interesting and fascinating patterns that change every second and never reproduce as well, and which I call the chronofaces. Then about chance works also that I have shown here. I will go quickly. Large pieces, almost like the ones that were shown at the CAF 4 years ago, and that I have shown here. And also an interest in microscopic things, and I have worked on lines that should never meet, and which creates little amoebas or bacteria that must populate the space without never touching the neighbor. And so the space is created, and one of those little curves comes in, and the other one comes and defines their shapes according to their neighbors. It's a kind of metaphor for the conquest of the West, where everybody can, shoot and take his own domain. So a few of these quickly. And then I had mentioned John Cage before. I've been fascinated by his rock drawings. And John Cage used to choose by chance a number of rocks and choose by chance a number of pens and brushes and create around the rocks that were placed on a sheet according also to chance to create a circular trace that looks almost like what happens in the Japanese gardens when the monks rake around the stones. And I thought this idea was wonderful, not John Cage's idea, but the monk's idea. It was a centuries-old idea to turn around rocks and leaving a trace. And I started developing that, of course, using my own means, which is always writing my own software to actually develop an idea. So I have a few examples of that. And actually, I have upstairs 3 of those rock drawings. Well, I'm going backward here. I'm sorry. So here is 1, 2. So they become more complicated, even more. And then the last one. So upstairs, I have a new way of rendering those stone drawings that appear in a very large piece and 2 smaller ones. Then I had another idea, also based on time, which come from the Chinese. And I've always been much interested by Tang and song painting and sculpture and pottery. And at the time, all the scholars and the emperor used to have 4 colors, 1 for each season. And they had celadon for spring and sang de boeuf for red for summer. And they had I think it's white for fall and black for winter. And so I have created a series of works where there is a work for each season, and they just change with their basic colors. And then I started something completely different. And I started that because of Jean Cocteau on the one hand, and because of Jérémy Sarchet, who is here, and is more a sculptor than you think, who actually showed once at the exit of a talk I gave at the College of Creative Studies, was showing a big tensegrity, a dodecahedronal tensegrity, and I was arrested by this interesting object that was about 3 feet in diameter, and I wanted to talk to him. And Jeremy is building all those tensegrity sculptures which are made with rods and strings that were invented at the turn of the 20th century and developed by Kenneth Nelson quite a bit, but he gave that his own turn. And as he left for Barcelona for a study abroad project, I became the guardian of his sculptures. And when I saw them, I discovered that they were very tensile and very springy and very interesting, and that I could use them to hang a pendulum that would be hanged from a moving top as I placed the sculpture in the breeze. And I started to make those breeze drawings. And why did I do that? It's because the quality of the lines that result from the dynamics of the flying pen over the paper with a very light hand, a very light touch. And I had been impressed by discussions by Jean Cocteau, which you can read about or hear about on UbiWeb. And Jean Cocteau was saying, if the line is alive, the drawing will be beautiful. And he has expanded on that. He said also that a line was like a knotted drawing. And a knotted drawing, and that drawing was an unknotted line. So he spoke a lot about drawing and the quality of the line, and for the first time, I found something that was much better than whatever I have been able to do with the software I was writing over the past 35 years. So I've been quite fascinated by that, and I have done more and more of it. And now I have 3 pieces upstairs like that. I have been combining works created by software with breeze drawing to create some kind of mixed media experience. So here I have another breeze drawing series here. And the last thing about giving life to the string is something that I derived from the style of Bryce Marden, who creates art with ribbons, which are thrown at random on the canvas. And I did that also my own way and in my own style, and in using the waves that shape my drawings all the time. So I will show that quickly. There are upstairs, there are 4 of these, and I have made them in the style of an artist that has always inspired me, and that's Peter Mondrian. So this is one of the pieces that is upstairs. And in those pieces, I create lines that have a story along their length. They change width, they change colors. They have this interesting curves that comes from riding the waves that is underneath but is invisible. And, well, I think this concludes my talk. Oh, yes. I'm not going to present any images from Vera's work because it's upstairs. But I would like to mention her briefly. She's a wonderful woman. I met her for the first time in my last trip to Paris. She's 86 years old. She graciously gave me time for a meeting. I reached her house in 14e arrondissement. And when I rang the bell, I heard a voice coming from above telling me that the key was coming to me. And seconds later, a string attached to a key came down, and I could take the key, open the door, and go up the stairs, because being aged, it's difficult for her to manage with those stairs. And I had to help her to make coffee and so forth. And I wanted to see her because she started using computers in '66, which was something like 8 years before I did. And she's really an incredible woman. She does beautiful work. And an incredible story happened to me when I was there. I came with a portfolio to show her my work. And she looked at the work and said, well, that's interesting. I must show you a book that you will like. And so she stood up and went to her shelf and came back with a book. I looked at the book. It was wonderful. All the story of computer art in the 70s and the 80s. And I said, well, I'm going to note the references of the book to buy it. And she told me, oh, you can't, because The book is exhausted. Even the author doesn't have a copy, and the publisher doesn't have a copy, so no luck. And then at that point, the telephone rings, and she goes to answer, and she speaks German, and strangely, I can understand what they say. They talk about me, they talk about the book. In fact, the man at the end of the line is the author of the book, and he's in Provence, and he comes to Paris on the next day. And Vera told him about my interest for the book, and he says, "Oh, that's okay, I still have a copy. Give him your book, and I will bring you another one tomorrow." And so with that in mind, I believe that chance is really something incredible. So this is Vera for Véronique Molnar.
No, the author of the book.
I could not pronounce it.
All right. I'll have you spell it after.
Yes, I will send it to you if you want. So,
Have him call me.
yes, okay. He might have another book.
Right.
So this is what I wanted to say about her. But it's, I think, a privilege to have her work up there. I have a last comment to make. She was invited to show pieces at the Museum of Modern Art last year in a show called Line. And what is very interesting is that she was invited to show works that she did before she started using computer, but they didn't invite any of the pieces she made, with her software. So this is where doing art with software is still nowadays.
To be fair, I think they were probably emphasizing the handmade line, but rather than the image of the line, and that's one thing we're finding, that there need not be any distinction between what makes a line and what presents a line. That way, the computer is every bit as much a tool, an extension of the hand, which is, I think, one of the underlying thrusts of this series of shows that are going on at Kavli. Well, thank you, Jean-Pierre. And Jeremy Tarcher, am I getting the name? Tarcher. And it's Sarche. I know who Jeremy Tarcher is. Okay, never mind. I was afraid I'd be doing this all night. This name sounds like this name, and Jeremy, and it's Sarche rather than Sarchet, right?
Correct.
Okay. Jeremy Sarche is represented, as you saw upstairs, only by two light boxes with a pair of titles that only deepens their mystery. So unpacking Jeremy's methods, techniques, and ultimately content will be especially revealing. I'll let him go on without further ado, but I do want to remind all of you to, if you haven't already, to turn off your cell phones. Something I should have reminded you at the beginning, but it's never too late. Thanks, Jeremy.
Thank you. I will treat myself to a little water here before I begin.
Do any of you otherwise need water? No? Good. Okay.
Well, hello, everyone. My name is Jeremy Sarche, and I'm the artist in training here, and I'm privileged to say this is my debut in the art world. This is the first show that I'm taking part in, and I owe a great bit of gratitude to Jean-Pierre Hébert for, teaching me quite a number of important things about what might lie ahead down the road for me. So we'll see. I hope to get to 10,000 hours in the field of art, and this is step one. So I'm a proud undergraduate alumnus of UCSB physics, and that can provide a little bit of background into how it came that I ended up with that piece that's upstairs, the two little humble photographs of, a tree vibrating. And while it may not occur to an average passerby in the forest that such an artifact can be extracted, for someone like me, you have to recall that 30% of the undergraduate physics curriculum consists of simple harmonic motion and sinusoidal oscillation. And so, as you may think that, as the line goes, for one who is a hammer, everything begins to look like nails. For one who is a physics student, everything begins to look like simple harmonic oscillation. So I see a tree, and of course, if anyone spends enough time in the forest, eventually you'll come across such a tree, which is overturned horizontally. Its top half has been long gone, taken away in the ocean, and its roots remain in the side of the earth in a little berm. So there's one fixed end and one free end that behaves a little bit like a springboard, and of course, many such objects can be found as we go through our daily lives. You can see a street lamp or a telephone pole, any sort of antenna on a car. All of these things behave in this same fundamental way, and that is, when disturbed, seek to regain a little bit of, regain their equilibrium, you could say. So any system can be framed in that respect. Let's bring it back to, it seeks to restore its equilibrium. So these thoughts are moving around in my head as I walk through and observe and think, and it's always exciting when I can have a little bit of creative flash of insight to reveal something that might not be visible or apparent. And so photography, of course, is great because you can do these long exposure photographs, that is to say, compress rather, you can accumulate time within the camera. And of course, this goes way back. I remember when I was studying Picasso in elementary school, I was not as interested in his extensive works on canvas and painting, but I was struck by 2 or 3 images in the corner of the textbook. Thank you, Kevin. We're oscillating wildly on the levels. This may be a little more stable. Perfect. So Picasso had 2 or 3 maybe obscure long exposure photographs of himself with a candle or a lighter, making his gesture drawings, and the camera records that. And of course, this is one of the most exciting things in my mind at the time that one can do with a camera. And of course, you can step back and look at it a little more philosophically or a little more abstractly, and you could say, well, even the muscle fibers and the elastic tendons in Picasso's arm are seeking to restore a little equilibrium. And so there is that unity that I think lies underneath the appeal of an image like that for me. And perhaps that makes it a conceptual piece, or perhaps I need to spend a little more time figuring out exactly what my methods are, because I feel that is yet to be determined. So the piece up there is simple and pleasing to the eye. It can be recreated with a computer program very easily, but I think it's more beautiful that it exists already out there right this moment in a biological program that is a tree with cellulose and lignin and the elastic behavior of those structures. Of course, the same thing happens at all scales, and large and small, and so that's a little bit about my little long exposure photograph. Now, and in terms of my methods, I suppose that I'm inclined towards being more of a maker, and I can sort of imagine myself most comfortable in a large hardware store gathering pieces together to create some setup that, like the simple harmonic oscillation long exposure photograph, reveals some clever or subtle or distinct or you could say, let's see here. Well, so I think I'll wrap it up here. Thank you all for your time, and
You don't have any images?
no slides
No slides.
tonight without the aid of computer.
I've been familiar with with a certain aspect of the work of our last artist, Ethan Turpin, for a couple of years now. Ethan has shown his stereotypical images in Los Angeles and Riverside. But I was introduced to, as I'm sure a lot of you were this evening, to a whole other body of work that he's generated that visually caught me entirely by surprise and conceptually didn't surprise me at all. Their intricacy and their evasive but persuasive logic suffuses throughout their presence and presents a kind of grounded world with the same humor and clear emphasis that his stereopticon images do. I'll let Ethan elaborate further on what he's doing here and how they relate to his images for two eyes. Thanks.
Okay, so this is one of the prints upstairs, and this is I'm showing this mostly to ground what I'm about to show you in this result. I think of the print series. I have 7 images in a suite of this imagery. These are the fossils of the pixel behavior, which I think of as a living, sort of a proxy living organism. Which actually can be seen now at the Santa Barbara Contemporary Arts Forum, which is in Paseo Nuevo, upstairs across from the Center Stage Theater, if you haven't been there. That's sort of like where the organism lives. And this is the fossil. So I'm going to actually show you a short video that demonstrates that process and that thing. Oh, yeah, sorry.
The following is a brief demonstration of my specific explorations in video feedback. It starts with a video projector on a white wall. This camera is wired to the projector and then pointed at the same surface as the projector. The result is a video feedback loop. Every change in the angle, zoom, or other settings of the camera is replicated in the image many-fold. These kinds of effects were discovered soon after video became readily available. People may interact with the video by moving in the camera's path. Here the image is restarted with a cigarette lighter. I've become interested in a particular phenomena that I stumbled upon while finessing the zoom and exposure, chasing the glow of the signal noise on a blank screen. Self-sustaining patterns of black lines and dots began to emerge with complex geometries. I'm interested in exploring the similarities between the video medium's behavior and that of patterns in nature.
this is an image from the show at the Santa Barbara Contemporary Arts Forum. And that's a video projection using the system that was just described in the video. I don't know if everyone could hear that. Let me know if you couldn't, but okay. And in the foreground is a specimen from the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History. That could be 100 million year old ammonite, which would have like a squid-like creature living inside it. And I'll show you some of the patterns on the shell in a moment. But in any case, just to go back over a little bit about the very hard to describe recursive system, which is a video feedback loop. In the same, you're probably familiar with audio feedback, which is a generally unpleasant experience. But it often starts with like a whoop, 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 and then it turns into a high-pitched kind of shriek usually. Well, video can also feedback. I mean, the audio feedback is when, say this, if I took this mic over there to the speaker, the mic would be listening to the space where the speaker is, and the speaker would be, emitting the sound that the mic is picking up, and that's how you get a loop. Well, the video camera, say I hooked up a video camera to this projector here and pointed it at this screen with nothing in the way, all that the camera would see is its own pixels over and over and over and over again. And so what I do is I carefully adjust settings on the camera and a little bit on the projector too, and the light levels in the room, so that when the pixels are observing themselves, so to speak, that they pick up on sort of imperfections and in a very high contrast system. And what emerges are patterns that are essentially moire patterns, like when you take, say you had two screen doors and you sort of started to move them around over each other, you would get sort of emergent incidental patterns coming out of that. Well, if you imagine that with a field of pixels on top, say hundreds, on top of each other, that's kind of what's happening. And the radial patterns occur because the camera is on a twist. And so you get, as you saw early in the video, you get this spiral. If the camera is not zoomed in at all, then you get frame after frame after frame, but it's sort of, before you twist it, it's like it's like there's mirrors on both sides of you, and you see this regressive frame of mirrors. Well, if you twist it, then you get this vortex. By zooming down deep into the vortex, it essentially flattens that spiral and like squishes it on top of itself. So you've got many tight spirals all layered. And with this very chunky grid of pixels that creates patterns. So that's my best attempt to explain what's going on with that. It's hard to explain because it's a paradox, essentially, at least from our, because we're not used to this sort of nonlinear kind of time. So this show at the Santa Barbara Contemporary Arts Forum, which I'd love if you all went and saw it, because it's a lot of fun because it's interactive and it sort of does a better job than what I can say about it, is composed of specimens that I borrowed from the Natural History Museum. This is a cabinet of curiosities, and in the middle of it is a TV with a video camera pointed at it. So it's actually generating patterns that are similar looking to those in the mostly sea creatures, invertebrate specimens, coral, shells, sponge, sea stars, that are, they also exhibit similar patterns because there's spiral growth going on over, units such as cells or what have you that are analogous in this case to the pixels. That is a pattern on another ammonite, which I was surprised to learn and delighted that that's joinery. That isn't the markings of a parasite on the surface or anything since its death. That is actually the shell holding itself together. This is a worm created that. There's a print from, I just tore a page out of a book by Ernst Haeckel and he was illustrating at the turn of the 20th century cross sections of these same kinds of organisms. They look a lot like the video feedback. Diatoms, yeah, corals. But yeah, he was well known for his drawings of diatoms because he actually made some discoveries about them. Okay, this is not something I understand very well, and it's hard to see in this frame, but this was just an image from Wikipedia on something called Rule 30, which is an algorithm that when plotted in a computer creates triangle patterns that look exactly like these patterns on this shell. And so what I'm sort of looking to learn here a bit more is what are the rules or the algorithms that sort of describe the behavior in the video feedback. Sure. Before this one? Oh, the Rule 30 thing? Yeah. That's not a very good photo of the TV that's in the Cabinet of Curiosities piece. Okay, here, and this is the ammonite that's inside the gallery, in with the projection interactive piece. It's rather large, and there's those patterns. This is that space, the installation inside there, and it's still from that pattern, which you can reach into and affect. And it sustained itself over the course of the day. You know, the interns turn it on, and then they turn it off at the end of the day, and it evolves over time. It has certain states that it sort of likes, where it stabilizes. It's never exactly the same. And I think of this as that the video feedback, in a sense, the video system is, in the case of the prints, it's becoming a drawing device because it's generating lines. And what is interesting to me is that one moment the lines can have a sort of like fascinating yet repulsive quality, sort of like, you wouldn't want that growing on your bathroom floor or whatever, or in your fridge. And then the next moment it can look like sacred geometry, like you would have it, over an altar or something like that. And for me, this is a sort of kind of a religious art piece. That this is the sort of the closest thing I have to that, I think. Because it's an expression of fundamental geometry and nature, and here it is appearing in the video medium, which I work with in other ways. I make documentaries and things like that, and yet inherent in our little home movie cameras and things like that is the potential for this, and so that I find fascinating. And this is like just a slight shift, maybe a difference in a few minutes from the other one, which one might have been disturbed more and then shifted into a different state. This is the bottom of a shell, and just an example that it is sort of an analogous pattern to this which the video pixels generated. And so this is a print upstairs. And so the process that I use is I'm basically taking video stills from the installation where it's moving, and I think of that as Jean-Pierre actually, in discussion with him, he kind of described it to me this way, that you can be in the room with a lion, and that's a very powerful experience. You can take a video of the lion, and that's pretty cool. And you can take a still of the lion, and that's still cool, but it's removed from the life experience, like the lion. And so I think of these as fossils of the installation, and I take video stills, and through a process of making a transparency and making a solar plate, photopolymer plate, I make an etching with ink to print these. So this is an edition of prints. Briefly, I'm just going to show you a little bit about, there's two other pieces or projects that I have here. There's a large kaleidoscope, which I invite you to check out. Bring a friend, because you can look at it with each other, at each other through it. And that's in this room over here. And then down the hall, you can see what's an iceberg. So this was a news photo of a large chunk of ice that broke off of Antarctica. It was large enough that it was given a name, B-17, and it was drifting north towards New Zealand. And it was kind of shocking, and people concerned with climate change definitely noticed it. And I have been thinking lately about, over the last couple of years, about how do we communicate and visualize climate change? How do we get better at understanding it, perceiving it, because it's such a large problem, so intimately connected to our daily lives and completely invisible, right? So I changed this into a moire pattern based on the print image. This is an RGB dot matrix, and this is in fact moireing its own pattern because of the projector. But if people in the back probably are seeing something closer to a black and white image than people in the front, which are seeing colored dots. And that's the same with the print in the hallway. If you walk down the hallway towards it, you'll end up with fingerprint-sized dots. Whereas back here, it's a black and white image. And that's sort of like newspaper printing is like that in certain ways. So that has to do with our perception of the iceberg. Can you see the iceberg for what it is? And kind of imagining, well, what if I were to imagine the chemistry, though I'm completely uneducated about that, the dots are sort of like, maybe those are the molecules that have been perturbed and with global warming. And then the kaleidoscope. This was a show at the Atkinson Gallery at Santa Barbara City College in 2009. This was just sort of one life that piece had. This piece is called Power and Magic, and so the kaleidoscope is pointed at the sky, the clouds in the sky, where you can see those patterns. It was shown with also 3 telescopes that were pointed at various kind of landmarks from that wonderful vantage point there, which included the Mission, burned Rocky Peak, because the fires had just occurred, and an oil platform. And then the kaleidoscope had this kind of pattern looking into the sky. And I'm just sort of thinking about cosmologies and, again, contemplating the climate and how we perceive the climate. And in this case, kind of a magical sense of that. And that's it. Thank you.
I don't know if this occurred to you, but as it did to me. But looking at certain of Ethan's feedback patterns, they resembled that drawing or print of Jean-Pierre's of the figures that do not touch, and also the patterns on the ammonite that Ethan brought forward reminded me of a couple of the images that Tatiana showed us earlier. I don't remember if they're associated with the snails or with it was the islands in especially the island drawing. The islands is lichen. So which all goes to prove that patterns are patterns. But if anybody out here would like to expand on that idea, or would like to inquire as to any of the other ideas or practices, techniques, methods, yes.
I just want to acknowledge Jean-Pierre, who's been putting up these algorithms shows for so many years, and I have to say that the show tonight and your speeches and I mean your conversations with us and the work is a really powerful expression of what's going on not only at KITP, but what's going on with the curator, Jean-Pierre, who lives in a world of elementals and has been so powerfully expressing them, and that he gathers about him a whirlwind or a tornado of young talent and old talent, actually, tonight, it's spinning so tight that it's like a great dinner, So thank you so much.
you.
I just have a very practical question for Ethan. How long is the exhibit going to be at CAF?
Until December 23rd.
Thank you.
And they're not open Monday, but every other day.
Anyone else?
Jean-Pierre, on those, what you were calling, the Cocteau said the lines are very alive, that one where they're very expressive. You drew some of them and then others were computer, is that what you said?
I have 5 pieces that have been built with the flying pen. I call them the breeze drawings. So 2 have only breeze lines, and 3 have little islands that have been created digitally with software and a printer. And after I did the print, I placed the sheets under the tensegrity with little pebbles coming from Iris Gardens and Yard to actually protect the small patterns from the action of the drawing instrument. And so this is how the 2 mediums were mixed and separated by those little pebbles or little rocks. And I always like the pun that those little pebbles were at the origin of the word calculus that is used a lot here for mathematics and physics. And it accomplishes the same programming element in my drawings than the equations that I can use when I program. So I'm always using calculus.
Well, I want to say thank you. You've certainly expanded my idea of what is art, and you've also inspired me a lot. I was a photographer before it went digital, and I haven't been into the art as much, but to hear each of you speak and to see your images just sort of resonates with me. And I love Jeremy's kind of untouchable, you don't quite know what it is, because sometimes art speaks through you somehow and you don't really know how you try to express it. And so, and Tatiana's images with the snail, who would think a snail would be so beautiful? And just so many things about what you're all doing, the whole show just speaks to me, and it just inspires me. Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. We don't have to have it to entertain a question, but we have time for one more. But if we don't, thank you all very much. Oh, wait. Jeremy?
I wonder if any of you would like to talk to us about how you feel about mystery.
Yeah, given the open-ended nature of the question, although it gets to the heart of the at least the title of the show, I think that we can ask that of the artist, as Lars said over the wine at the reception immediately following. Thank you all for coming.